The best late-night conservative talk show in America, Sackheads Radio. And listen, there are no people better on the air to give you the best in conservative talk than Sackhead Sean and Sackhead Clint. And we're working on the immigration papers for a certain other guy who happens to work here, too. For those who are tuning in around the world to the best in late-night conservative talk, Sackheads Radio.
And welcome to another edition of Sackheads Radio. I'm your host, Sackhead Clint. Here, sitting to my right, is Sackhead Sacco. We're live from Freedom Fest 2015, Las Vegas, Nevada. We have a very special guest with you today. We are here with Mr. Joel Griffith from the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, sir.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be with you.
It's excellent to have you here, and we had an opportunity to talk a little bit yesterday, and I'm very excited to have you here today. One of the researchers for the chief economist over at the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to know a little bit about what you guys are doing over there.
Well, we're doing a lot, primarily focusing on how state policies can actually affect where people live, where people start their businesses, what those policies are, and how best state governments can implement positive change. So,
for example, like I know there's an influx right now of people from, say, California going into Texas, and Governor Perry came out and he said essentially that he wants to take those people from California and bring them into Texas for business. California's a horrible business environment. I know because our business is based out of California. And it seems that we have more people going into Texas. I'm using that as one example. I'm sure you have other examples to share. And is that due to the fiscal policies of the individual states?
That, in large part, is responsible. And you bring up California and Texas, and that really is probably the most stark example of people clearly choosing freedom-oriented states over big government states. Over the most recent 10-year period, approximately 1 million people, U.S. citizens, have left California to move elsewhere.
Right.
And at the same time, Texas has seen about the same amount move into Texas from elsewhere in the country.
And it seems like that would, you look at, California now maybe is going through some kind of, maybe they've stopped some of the downward spiral they were in. How, I don't know. They still have that bullet train to nowhere, which is like a great idea, right? And then, but you have Texas now. What is that doing as far as bringing those types of people in? What is that doing for them from a financial standpoint?
Well, for people moving to Texas, it often means a significant rise in their personal income, even if they do not get a pay raise. And I've actually written a few stories on this of just using real-life examples. Mm-hmm. And one of the situations was a friend of mine who moved from Washington, D.C. to Austin, Texas, and actually took a bit of a pay cut.
Okay.
But after moving to Texas, she saw her take-home pay increase by, I think it was close to $1,000 a month. When you add in all of the lower taxes, when you add in the lower cost of living. And she's getting ahead. People are moving from other parts of the country, especially just starting out, and able to buy a home, have money to actually save for retirement. And that, in large part, is due to the fact that Texas has no income tax,
right,
lower property taxes, lower sales taxes as a whole. And it's easier for other types of people, particularly risk takers, to go ahead and take a chance on new businesses in the state. And as you and I both know, much of our economic growth depends on those risk takers establishing successful ventures that then have jobs for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems that there are other states in the union. Not just Texas is kind of like the prime example that comes to my mind. But you look at the model of Texas and how successful it's been, particularly when we were going through the rough economic downturn that we just had and we're still in, really. But Texas hasn't been hit as hard. And why won't the other states or the federal government particularly pay attention to that model and go down that road? It seems like the politicians still want their big social programs. They still want their to tax the big evil corporations, the big evil business. Our business here, we're incorporated, we're small, but we still pay the corporate the corporate tax penalty, I call it, in California, which is a flat, you pay X number of dollars just because you have that corporation title. So how can studying these states help us on a federal level?
Well, let's go back to California.
Sure.
it's not always in the best interest of the politicians to actually implement the reforms. And if you go ahead and look at, say, state budgets, California versus Texas, Texas has lower taxes, but they actually employ more people proportionally in the most needed areas of government, such as education, fire, police protection, the essential services the government should be there to provide, like police and fire. Texas actually is able to employ more per 10,000 because they do not have all of the cushy benefits, and they're not as bought and purchased as California legislators are by public sector unions.
Right.
And every time you have reforms tried to push through in states like California or most recently Illinois, the public sector unions then pile on and really stop any progress from being made, and it just continues to saddle the future generations with an enormous amount of debt, and you're going to have to choose whether to live with that burden or to leave your family, your friends, your life behind and go elsewhere. And that's what's happening across the country.
Now, it's interesting you talk about the public sector unions, and this is something, this just came to mind. So unions were originally developed, and they're supposed to protect the worker against the big evil corporation, right? So why do we need them to protect the worker from the government? Because these public sector employees work for the people, so how that doesn't make any sense to me. Why should public employees be allowed to unionize when the unions were there to protect from against the big business, not to protect public sector employees from the government that employs them when they're supposed to answer to the people? Does that make sense at all?
No, it does not make sense unless you look at, whose self-interests are enabled here. And in that type of a situation with the public sector, you end up with one party on both sides of the bargaining table.
Right.
When you're negotiating for your contract, but then you're also, through your entity, funneling money over to those same politicians. It becomes a situation where a small percentage of the population that's employed by the government has an outsized voice with politicians that are inclined to look after their own careers first. And I guess, to use another state example, if you look at what happened in Wisconsin with Governor Scott Walker and the successful reforms he put in place, if you look at the immense amount of money that was, which is our right, it's our free speech rights, but if you look at the immense amount of resources that were put in to knocking off legislators and knocking off the governor for actually pushing through reforms that help the people as a whole, you get a sense of how entrenched those interests are.
Absolutely. Now, we know that each state's economy affects the economy of our nation as a whole. That's a no-brainer. Should we be focusing as a nation? Should we be focusing on policies as an individual state-by-state basis, or does the federal government have more, because each of those states' economy coming together and really affecting our national economy as a whole? Should the federal government have more input into almost like a blanket national economic policy or a blanket policy in terms of how businesses should operate or where they should incorporate or rules pertaining to businesses and so forth in each particular state? And I say that because, look, California used to be, the 7th largest economy in the world, and I know it's decreased. I know it used to feed the world. And you look at the water policies of California, for example. California's in a drought right now, not because of lack of rainfall on one hand, but there have been no water projects built since the 70s. And there have been funds put in place by the voters to do so. Nothing's been done. They're not saving any water. They flush the delta. 31 billion gallons of fresh water wasted into the ocean because they want to flush the delta to prevent some fish that's not even native to the area from dying. Ridiculous. But you look at those policies and kind of how California has really slid, particularly in the agricultural market, and how that's affected the economy of that state, which then obviously affects the economy of a nation as a whole. How involved, I guess, is a long way of saying, how involved should the federal government be in state policies because it can have such an adverse impact on the national economic scale? Well,
that's a great question. Well, our Constitution greatly limits the power of the federal government to be involved in individual states. The biggest area in which federal government can be involved in states would be anything that involves interstate commerce. So it is a limited role the federal government can play. What the federal government can do, and what it should do, hopefully in the coming years, is stop the interference into the different states. That's where we could see immense improvements. For instance, the Environmental Protection Agency. If you look at what they have done according to a clause in the Constitution that allows them to regulate interstate waterways. They have successfully wielded their power to argue that regulating interstate waterways can involve regulating almost isolated ponds of water or standing water. And this is impacting ranchers, developers, farmers across the country, and it is devastating some communities. So I would argue that rather than have the federal government intervene in different state policies and say do this or do that, let's just start getting government out of the way in those areas in which they've encroached on the constitutional role. And I just back to the water situation. I was actually in Fresno over this weekend, and I've been reading about the situation with being there and seeing those dried up fields and seeing the signs that say no water, no jobs. It really brings home the point that these really misguided environmental policies are hurting, and not just the ranchers and the farmers, but all of the tens of thousands of middle-class people that have depended on those jobs to actually live an independent, self-sufficient life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's horrible. And you bring up about the fact that the federal government can that interstate commerce is what's affected by that. We talked about California, the government created Dust Bowl, which you have there now through the central part of the state. I mean that's agriculture that used to ship out worldwide, and I'm not a big federal government guy. I'm really not. But when you have state policies that affect now our ability to interstate commerce, global commerce, really. I'm talking about the agricultural situation in California. Do you think is there a legal way for the federal government to come in and say, hey, your policies are now directing global commerce, which is have a negative impact on our economy as a nation, and we have this right and obligation to do this under the Constitution?
Well, although I fully support relaxing these restrictions that are devastating the communities in California, you have to be very cautious of the precedent that any intervention of the federal government on that state level would create. And even if I might like the outcome, of that intervention, it has to be done the correct way, or else it could be used to do things we don't want in the future, and it really would erode the rule of law. So I would really argue get federal government out of the way with the EPA, and then on the state level, the focus has to be on pushing these state legislators to stop rolling over to these special interests.
Excellent. Mr. Griffith, it has been a pleasure, sir, speaking with you today. Is there anything else? Where can our listeners read some of your articles you've written? I know it's on the Heritage Foundation site. You've written some excellent articles. I was just reading The Big Lie that Obama been telling about the middle class. Excellent article. I encourage our listeners to check it out. Where can they find you, sir?
They could find most of my recent articles at heritage.org under my name. I've also written extensively on Red Alert Politics and somewhat on Breitbart.com as well. And there are several very good pieces on Heritage about the exaggerated claims of environmentalists back in the construction of the Alaska pipeline. I would recommend they take a look at that. Some great quotes from ages past from doom and gloom scientists that are now being used as references in the present battles.
Excellent, sir. It has been a pleasure. And that's it from this edition of Sackhead's Radio Show. I am Sackhead Clint, live from Freedom Fest 2015, signing off Las Vegas, Nevada. Sacco, take us out.
Conservative talk show in America, Sackheads Radio. And listen, there are no people better on the air to give you the best in conservative talk than Sackhead Sean and Sackhead Clint. And we're working on the immigration papers for a certain other guy who happens to work here too. For those who are tuning in around the world to the best in late night conservative talk, Sackheads Radio.
Sack you. Sack you.
Radio.
Sack you. Sack you.
Radio.
Sack.
The best late night conservative talk show in America. In America.
Into the silo.
And in this web was a large, I'm pretty sure it was the biggest spider I've ever seen.